first talk I have here. I may have played it before. It's from Wall Thornhill. It's Where Has Science Gone, I believe. And we'll go from there. I want to play it because I want to listen to it. My nephew painted that. Dave, painting art monkey on DeviantArt. And away we go. Whatever happened to real science? Just as much of modern science has become self-serving and striving for status and funding, the theory of how science should be done is similarly affected. An assessment of a theory based on degrees of belief might be useful if scientists didn't routinely ignore, minimize, or dismiss falsifying evidence and twiddle the countless knobs on their models to fit new data. The most glaring modern example of such behavior is the rejection of stark evidence of intrinsic redshift of quasars. Big Bang cosmology is already lifeless by its assessment, but belief keeps the corpse warm, while we allow the few scientists who judge the data according to their beliefs to control publication, funding, and press releases. Real science is dead. On May 7th, New Scientist published Do We Need to Change the Definition of Science? By Robert Matthews. Identified as the defining characteristic of real science by the philosopher Karl Popper more than 70 years ago. Falsifiability has long been regarded by many scientists as a trusty weapon for seeing off the menace of pseudoscience. The late Viennese thinker has been lauded as the greatest philosopher of science by the likes of Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. While Popper's celebrated book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, was described by cosmologist Frank Tipler as the most important book of its century. Times change, though. Popper's definition of science is being sorely tested by the emergence of supposedly scientific ideas which seem to fail it. From attempts to understand the fundamental nature of space-time to theories purporting to describe events before the Big Bang, the frontiers of science are sprouting a host of ideas that are seemingly impossible to falsify. It is not clear how people could conclude that Popper identified falsification as the defining characteristic of real science. If they actually read The Logic of Scientific Discovery, the book is about the logic associated with the discovery of new ideas. The title is not the objective characteristics of a reified abstraction. It clearly presents looking for false entailments as a convention. That's actually a quote from Popper on page 37. Convention. Falsifiability will accordingly have to be regarded as a proposal for an agreement or convention. Emphasis in original. That is, an agreement not to adjust a theory, but to consider any variation as an entirely new theory that must compete with all available alternatives, and to admit that the old version was falsified. The book is not so much about science as about an attitude, an eagerness to discover and to test new ideas, rather than to defend an established dogma against life's inevitable changes. On the next page, Popper writes, Thus, I freely admit that in arriving at my proposals, I have been guided in the last analysis by value judgments and
predilections.
But I hope that my proposals may be acceptable to those who value not only logical rigor, but also freedom from dogmatism, who seek practical applicability, but are even more attracted by the adventure of science and by discoveries which again and again confront us with new and unexpected questions, challenging us to try out new and hitherto undreamed of answers. The newest Scientist article, much of Popper's appeal rests on a clear-cut logic that seems to underpin the concept of falsibility. Popper illustrated this through the now celebrated parable of the black swan. Suppose a theory proposes that all swans are white. The obvious way to prove the theory is to check that every swan really is white. But there's a problem. No matter how many white swans you find, you can never be sure there isn't a black swan lurking somewhere. So you can never prove the theory is true. In contrast, finding one solitary black swan guarantees that the theory is false. This is the unique power of falsification, the ability to disprove a universal statement with just a single example, an ability, Popper pointed out, that flows directly from the theorems of deductive logic. Comment. Popper's emphasis is on testing, and he repeats that is something scientists decide to do. It doesn't exist independently in the passive-voiced objective world. Someone does it, or more commonly these days doesn't do it. Popper's idea isn't sorely tested by modern theories. Modern scientists simply decide not to discover new ideas. There are plenty of black swans swimming in the pond of science. Scientists just decided to define them as a different species rather than to look for a new theory that accounts for black swans. Philosopher Colin Howson of the London School of Economics in the UK believes it is time to ditch Popper's notion of capturing the scientific process using deductive logic. Instead, the focus should be reflecting what scientists actually do, gathering the weight of evidence for rival theories and assessing their relative plausibility. Howson is a leading advocate for an alternative view of science based not on simplistic true-false logic, but on the more subtle concept of degrees of belief. At its heart is a fundamental connection between the subjective concept of belief and the cold, hard mathematics of probability. Comment. Here is the point of departure from real science, where the perceived probability of a belief being true determines the course of science. This should sound familiar. After all, it is what scientists do for a living, and it is a view of scientific reasoning with a solid theoretical basis. At its core is a mathematical theorem which states that any rational belief system obeys the laws of probability, in particular the laws devised by Thomas Bayes, an 18th century English mathematician who pioneered the idea of turning probability theory on its head. Unlike Popper's concept of science, the Bayesian view doesn't collapse the instant it comes into contact with real life. It relies on the notion of accumulating positive evidence for a theory. Comment. It is this kind of thinking that has allowed the Big Bang theory to persist when it should have collapsed the instant it came into contact with real life. The observations that highly redshifted object quasars are connected to low-shift galaxies. In simple terms, redshift is not a measure of an expanding universe. We cannot rewind time to a metaphysical Big Bang. That's absolutely true. What happened is not science. It has been a process of selectively fitting the evidence to a belief in the Big Bang. Such a belief is not rational and shouldn't even qualify for a Bayesian test. Astrophysicist Robert Trotta of Oxford University rationalizes the Bayesian method. At first glance, it might appear surprising that a trivial mathematical result obtained by an obscure minister over 200 years ago ought still to excite so much interest across so many disciplines. From econometrics to biostatistics, from financial risk analysis to cosmology, published posthumously thanks to Richard Price in 1763. An essay towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chances by the Reverend Thomas Bayes, 1701-1761, had nothing in it that could herald the growing importance and enormous domain of application that the subject of Bayesian probability theory would acquire more than 2 centuries afterwards. However, upon reflection, there is a very good reason why Bayesian methods are undoubtedly on the rise in this particular historical epoch. The exponential increase in the computational power of the last few decades made massive numerical inference feasible for the first time, thus opening the door to the exploitation of the power and flexibility of a rich set of Bayesian tools.
Bayesian.
This is Bayesian. Looks like Bayesian to me. Thanks to fast and cheap computing machines, previously unsolved inference problems become tractable, and algorithms for numerical simulation flourished almost overnight. Cosmology is perhaps among the latest disciplines to have embraced Bayesian methods, a development mainly driven by the data explosion of the last decade. However, motivated by difficult and computationally intensive inference problems, cosmologists are increasingly coming up with new solutions that add to the richness of a growing Bayesian literature. Well, I think what he's saying is that science needs to be more open and honest. They've taken a certain doctrine and just run with it and don't allow anything else even to see the light of day. And that's just not right. But it's in line with everything else. The world has been corrupted in every way, shape, and form. End of part 1.
Star from another star formation site? Is it a very local bit of star formation? Is it a different way for such a supernova to occur? None of these seems very likely, so we have a real puzzle. Well, the problem stems from the theory of stars themselves. In fact, the models of stars are so complex that they are non-predictive. One wag suggested you could just as easily come up with a koala bear as a star from the complexity of the theory. The other thing is that a supernova explosion is not really understood. It's a very clever model, but it's totally beyond belief. You have a star which suddenly switches off a theoretical engine at the center, its nuclear furnace, and it suddenly implodes. So this requires the switch off to be sudden, and not only that, the implosion then has to rebound to form the explosion. Of course, this kind of model you would expect would form a spherical shell of material racing away from the star. But what do we see when we look at supernovae? Generally, they have an axis along which matter is ejected. So it's not spherical, the explosion. So this is another puzzle. In fact, it was June last year, it was reported that supercomputer models of supernovae failed to explode. All they did was to implode and collapse. So it's not surprising that astronomers are puzzled. This particular supernova shows a high degree of helium, which also is unexpected. So it was even suggested that perhaps this particular supernova was another type which is due to white dwarfs exceeding a certain mass and then exploding. And so they said maybe it was a collision of 2 white dwarfs, one of which was helium-rich. So you can see these special conditions that are being introduced in order to try and explain this supernova. Now, it's just a couple of years ago that I had published in the IEEE Transactions on Plasma Science my explanation of supernova 1987A, which shows structure. It showed 3 rings which were centered on an axis through the star, and these rings were made of bright beads. The one nearest the star, encircling where the star was, were very bright, and those further away were dimmer. But this kind of structure is just not explained by any theory of an exploding star.
Much of the strange and encumbered reasoning behind the standard supernova theory may be resolved if a supernova is reinterpreted as an electrical discharge.
In the electric universe model of stars, the complex chemistry to produce the heavy elements inside the star is unnecessary in a supernova. The idea is, of course, that there are populations of stars, and the first population of stars exploded and threw all of the heavier elements out into space where they were collected to make the second population of stars. Now, this is a very messy and inefficient way of producing the stars that we see in our own galaxy, for instance. Also, wherever you look, astronomers are finding anomalies in chemical compositions of stars, stars that shouldn't be there. They're the wrong age, the wrong population. Recently, looking at globular clusters, they've been puzzled by the chemical composition of those stars because it was thought they must have all been produced at the same time in the same event, and yet they're finding compositions which don't fit that picture. In the electric universe, all stars produce heavy elements at their surface, in their photospheres, where strong electrical discharge activity is taking place. And of course, on Earth in the laboratory, this is exactly the way we produce isotopes and heavier elements in the laboratory, is by electrical power applied to accelerators. So there's nothing mysterious there. The standard model, on the other hand, requires purely theoretical and untestable things to be going on unseen inside stars. When it comes to star exploding, the electrical model is simplicity itself, and it doesn't require the star to be of any particular age, because in the electrical model, of course, electrical power is supplied to all stars and is the source of their light and heat and the radiation from them. Now, Hans Alfvén pointed out that the circuits in space also include what are called double layers, where charge is separated across a very small region of space. Those double layers can act like a switch, and if that switch is thrown, then the circuit is broken, and all of the energy stored in the magnetic fields of that circuit, which can extend far beyond the star into the galaxy itself, is concentrated on that double layer, that switch. And that switch can actually be at the surface of a star. So a supernova explosion is purely an electrical explosion. It's the kind of thing that has been photographed, and you can see on YouTube, when high voltage transmission power lines, the circuit is opened at an inappropriate time, and a huge arc stretches between the two electrodes as they separate. So you could say that what you're looking at in a supernova explosion is the opening of a stellar switch, when that star suddenly brightens to the point where it can outshine all of the rest of the stars in that galaxy.
For continuous news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. News from the electric universe. Stay tuned to Thunderbolts.
In that folder until it completes all the videos. I'm pretty sure.
So let's look at stars. We've done galaxies, let's look at stars. Arthur Eddington, had the temerity to say, "It should not be too difficult to understand something as simple as a star." This is typical left hemisphere. His quote is typical: "Isolate, simplify and ignore a global view, because if you look at coronas, sunspots, flares, magnetic cycles, etc., his gas model doesn't predict any of them, and the alternatives are not explored. He dismisses electrical aspects in a few paragraphs. The failure of this approach is shown by continual complications with each new discovery. It's treated as an isolated, gravitating ball of gas. Conventionally, it's a body that satisfies three conditions. It's made of hydrogen plus a few impurities. Having a core of the lightest element is the most fanciful assumption. It's needed to allow the thermonuclear energy model to be viable. That also requires hypothetical extreme conditions in the core. It's only required by the thermonuclear theory and is completely untestable. It also has, that's unverifiable, and also the sequence of nuclear reactions that take place in the core cannot be verified. They're very complex and requires quantum tunneling, which I referred to earlier. And what's more, there's a more complex, different story for different stars. It's certainly not simple. It's an explosive model because one of the reactions is sensitive to the temperature to the fifth power. It also needs an unknown radiation zone to break down the X-rays from the nuclear core. There's no body known that has a radiation or the energy transferred through the body through a radiation zone, so this is hypothetical. And also, from the point of view of life on Earth and so on, it has a restrictive and variable Goldilocks zones distant from the star. It's not the best place to nurture life in the universe. Impossible stars. Formation by gravitational accretion doesn't work. It's never been explained satisfactorily. It has hydrogen, the lightest element in the core. The model doesn't predict the observed features or behaviour. It has different models for white dwarfs, neutron stars, etc. And the life story of stars is super complicated and untestable. And some stars do strange things. They switch from one place to another without going through the transition stages. Renowned scientists like Eddington, who made grave mistakes about the sun and Einstein's general relativity, he went out explicitly to prove Einstein correct, not to test his theory, continue to haunt us today. It gives the lie to the belief that science is self-correcting. It is not, given the way in which science is done today. As Eddington said, if there's no other way out, we may have to suppose that bright line spectra in the stars are produced by electric discharges. The clues were there, but what if was not followed through. Herschel reveals a ribbon of future stars. This was reported on March the 30th this year. So this is a very recent picture. Stars and planets are formed by powerful electromagnetic forces like pearls on a cosmic string. This is a quote from an earlier report. Gravity can be ignored. Plasma cosmology. There is no gravitational accretion. There's no way you can form a string like that using gravity. Gravity is a central force, and the material tends to come into a centre. It doesn't form a string. But this recent report says, and this is important, stars are shot out of the filaments by a slingshot mechanism. And there's a diagram here which shows the filaments moving around like those in the plasma ball, where they snake about. The stars, having been formed in this filament, are left behind as the filament moves on, and these stars are shot out. And it's interesting because Tony Peratt described to us once the effect seen in high-energy discharge experiments as these plasmoids scattered like buckshot. Now, it's not only stars that are formed here, it's all solid bodies, including planets. And they may be captured by the stars to form the weird assortment, over 3,500 of them so far, of exoplanetary systems that have been observed. New stars also may fission to produce hot Jupiters in very close orbits and achieve electrical stability with their changing electrical environment. The movement of the filaments, as I said, is like those in a plasma ball. Heavy elements convect into a cool core. This is interesting because those blue filaments you saw before are the coldest part of the cloud, and this is where the stars are forming. The traditional view is that the stars had to form by gravitational collapse and not lose any of the heat of the collapse, otherwise they couldn't start their nuclear fires. Well, this doesn't require any of that. It was one of the surprises for theorists is that the blue filament I mentioned is the coldest part of the cloud and contains 800 times as much mass as the Sun. This is not a surprise for plasma cosmologists. So, all stars have a cool planetary core. Stars and many planets are born together along the same electrical umbilical cord. Other planets and moons are born later in electrical fissioning events and capture events. Hydrogen and helium tend to form the outermost atmosphere. This is a diagram showing the actual form of the filaments. You'll notice the pattern there. This is showing an experimental pattern of a discharge on an insulating plate. And this shows a Martian electrical scar. You can see the similarities. As the cosmic lightning bolt fades, stars and planets are captured into planetary systems. So electric stars, they remain a gaseous electric discharge phenomena, like spherical searchlights following their birth. In fact, some of the characteristics of the photosphere is like that of a searchlight. All bright stars catalytically produce heavy elements in their photospheric plasma discharges. Red stars have gigantic anode sheaths. Sorry, I'll get the right picture there. Plasma discharges adjust to their environment by moving electrical barriers called plasma sheaths, or misleadingly magnetospheres, because they trap the magnetic fields inside. If Jupiter's plasma sheath were lit up, it would appear the size of the full moon in the sky at opposition. And its Galilean moons would be orbiting comfortably inside it. So red dwarfs are not dwarfs, and their bloated glowing anode sheaths are the cosmic wombs for life. Because inside that radiant red sphere, all satellites receive uniform heat and light over their entire surfaces. And it doesn't matter how they're moving or rotating, that will be the case. Of course, this poses a problem for the SETI project because radio waves cannot penetrate the glowing plasma sheath. So if these are the wombs of life, we don't have any way of radio communication with them. But of course, gravity can pass through. White dwarfs are not dwarfs at all, they're just stars with no bright photosphere and a faint white coronal discharge. These are some of the planetary systems that have been discovered. You can see it's quite a shambles. So as I said before, at the galactic scale, electromagnetic forces form these gigantic Birkeland currents and they dominate. At the planetary scale, inside the star's protective plasma sheath, gravity dominates. So you have to choose the region you're talking about when you're trying to apply your model to stars, galaxies and so on. In fact, inside the star's protective sheath, with gravity dominating, and it dominates because it cannot be electrically shielded, so the impact from all of the other stars in the universe is acting like a pressure in on the planets moving around the sun. In fact, this repulsive force from the rest of the universe can reverse the Earth's motion about the sun in 6 months. That is 6 sextillion tonnes by 140,000 miles an hour. So that gives you an idea of the impact. Then, well understood. So it's hard to extract the physical properties of a given red dwarf from its spectrum. That is also interesting. But the fact that there are so many molecular absorption features indicates that all of the requirements for life exist within that glowing envelope. So, all stars are electric. All red stars are gigantic. Planets can orbit within their anode glow, and even astronomers acknowledge that. They have suggested that there could be satellites orbiting within the Betelgeuse glow. However, with their notion that the red giant is formed by an ultra-hot core, those planets would not be suitable for life. In the electric universe, it has a cool core. Objects orbiting within the red envelope are suitable for life. Now, one of the very interesting things is that there are no seasons on any satellites orbiting within that red sphere, because the energy received on any body within that sphere is equal over the entire surface of that body. So that a planet orbiting within that red sphere has no seasons, even temperatures. In fact, I would say the brown dwarfs are the cosmic wombs of life in the universe. One of the interesting facts, of course, that would suddenly come out of this is that these red spheres are glowing plasma, and glowing plasma will not let radio waves pass through. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio waves is, in my opinion, a wasted effort, because anyone living on a satellite inside one of these glowing red wombs would not even be aware that there was a greater universe out there full of stars, let alone try and use radio, because any radio signals would not pierce that plasma. Just an interesting side issue here. So this is my view of Protosaturn, and I've just put 2 satellites there, but there are obviously more. Titan, for instance, would have been one of the satellites. Earth and Mars. So there they are inside this glowing shell, and the evidence of the earliest recollections of mankind appears to be that the purple dawn of creation was the skylight. That was the colour of the sky, purple dawn. And that is precisely the colour you would expect in this circumstance, because you have the red end of the spectrum, and you also have a certain amount of the violet and ultraviolet light due to electrical activity in the plasma. So this fits with the, if you like, the earliest recollections of mankind, that was our environment. 50% of red dwarfs have Earth-sized planets in their habitable zone. Remember I said that astronomers feel this is the place where life is most likely to be found. Now if you look at Jupiter, for instance, and consider that as a red dwarf, and its plasma sphere was lit up, Io has a 1.75 day orbit, Europa has a 3.5 day orbit, Ganymede 7 days, and Callisto 17 days. Any of the satellites that were released from Jupiter's grip would have a rotation rate which equaled their daily rotation rate, because they're locked always with the same face towards the central body. It suggests that the Earth and Mars had orbits which were about a day in length. This is the kind of information that you can get from this kind of model. The other thing is, you'll notice in this diagram, there is no Venus. So we have a huge red anode glow, which was what we call Protosaturn. We had a purple dawn of creation and no Venus. These are the important things to understand about Protosaturn. Just recently, a map of a nearby red dwarf was produced using a Doppler imaging technique. It's one of a pair of red dwarfs near Alpha Centauri with a separation of 3 astronomical units. There's a bright near-polar region which can be clearly seen in the upper right panels, and a darker mid-latitude area visible in the lower left panels is consistent with large-scale cloud inhomogeneities. However, that's an assumption that what we're looking at is an atmosphere, but we're not looking at an atmosphere, we're looking at a plasma sheath. So this variation said in the electric universe model would be due to objects orbiting within that plasma sheath, either inside or outside that plasma sheath, because that would affect the discharge. The other thing is that this bright spot towards the pole is the same kind of thing that's found at Betelgeuse, the red giant, which indicates that that's the electrical connection with the Birkeland currents that drive these particular stars. If I'm right, the patterns here should be more repetitive than weather patterns and without banding like Jupiter, which is undetectable so far by this technique, but you never know what they can do tomorrow. Red dwarfs and giants change in radius, which is not the kind of thing that you would expect if this is a normal body. However, this change in radius is the star's response to changes in its electrical environment. It's quite natural. It's a plasma effect. They also tend to flicker in brightness. All of this is indicative of a star lacking the stabilising effect of the bright photosphere of bright stars. That's according to Don Scott's transistor model. That is a stabilising influence in all bright stars. Red stars don't have that luxury. Protosaturn's capture. This is the interesting part of it. This took me decades to try and figure out, because the model of planets arranged with their poles in a line is unstable. There's no Newtonian theory to explain a daisy chain of planets. So it eventually dawned on me that what we had was a dynamic arrangement where Protosaturn, which is in this diagram over here, that's Protosaturn, and you can just see a few little brighter red dots behind it. They are the Earth and Mars and other satellites. That's meant to represent those satellites. The explanation came to me once I had realised that the stabilisation of the planetary orbits as we see them today, why is the Newtonian system a clockwork system, or it appears to be a clockwork system, when you only have one force? Well, the answer is you cannot have a stable system with one force. There has to be a feedback mechanism. And as I explained the other day, you can change the mass of a planet or a star by either placing charge on it or taking charge away. And it occurred to me that a small star like Protosaturn entering the environment of the Sun would suffer a drastic change in its electrical environment, with a result, actually, that Protosaturn would have become one gigantic comet, because a body which is negatively charged with respect to its environment is a cometary body, and a body that's positively charged with respect to its environment is an anode in the discharge, and it is a star. So this was a change, a sudden change, once Protosaturn approached the solar system at that time closely. At least it would have been most drastic once it entered the heliosphere, the boundary of the Sun's environment with interstellar space. So Saturn as a comet is removing electrons, and the result is that it is losing mass, it's accelerating towards the Sun. The bodies behind it, actually, sorry, I got that around the wrong way. The Protosaturn itself is losing electrons, as comets do. They are being passed on to its satellites. The satellites are gaining in mass. Saturn is losing in mass. Conservation of energy says that Protosaturn accelerates towards the Sun, and this is part of the electrical capture mechanism. The Earth and Mars and the other satellites gaining in mass will tend to fall behind and line up, rather like Comet Shoemaker Levy 9. The electrical discharge, the polar discharge, in my opinion then, is the central column of Saturn's cometary discharge. We were sitting in this cometary tail, right in the middle of it. And all of the plasma discharge effects that were witnessed by the ancients and chiselled into rock come from that period of capture. I've said as a cometary body, Protosaturn loses electrons, it accelerates towards the Sun. All of this could explain all of the plasma phenomena, discharge phenomena, recounted by Dave Talbot and Eduardo Cardona. The latest measurements by Pitieva and Standish suggest the astronomical unit is increasing about 23 feet per century. That means that the Earth is actually, its orbit is shifting over time. But according to the beliefs of astronomers, the astronomical unit shouldn't change at all. The mechanism I'm describing for the modification of gravity provides a mechanism that can be tested, because the Earth's orbit expansion should be a discontinuous function with discrete jumps following major solar storms and at Venus's inferior conjunction, when we sit in the cometary tail of Venus. So there are various means of testing these ideas too, outrageous as they may seem.
Asteroid warning. Rock bigger than Empire State Building shooting towards Earth. An asteroid bigger than the Empire State Building, which has been branded potentially hazardous, is moving towards Earth this week. The object, known as asteroid 2006 QQ23, is expected to skim past Earth within a week. The celestial body is around 570 meters in diameter and is one of around 6 asteroids of this size that come by Earth each year. NASA has dispelled concerns that the rock, which has been branded as potentially hazardous, will hit Earth. Planetary defense officers for NASA, Lindsey Johnson and Kelly Fast, told CNN that there is nothing to fear. Ms. Fast said, "It's the ones we don't know about that we're concerned about." Mr. Johnson even said the asteroid was more or less benign. The asteroid is expected to skim past Earth at a distance of 7.4 million kilometers on August the 10th. And that's tomorrow. Oh, I'm going to play a video. I found it just kind of scouting around. And you know how Wall says that planets can be inside of stars. Well, planets can be inside of planets too. I got a little video here. They discovered something very unusual on Neptune. And I'm going to share a team thing. All right, here we go.
Worlds with it.
Aha, yes. Okay.
In worlds. Presented by Science at NASA. They say you can't judge a book by its cover, but what about planets? Take Neptune, for example. For many years, especially since 1989, when Voyager 2 flew past Neptune and measured its gravity field, astronomers have known that the blue giant harbors a secret world inside. Hidden deep below the azure cloud tops lies a rocky core not much larger than Earth. Uranus has one too. These worlds within worlds could have exotic properties, including scorching hot oceans and diamond rain. If only researchers could peel back the clouds for a closer look. About 30 light-years away, a Neptune-sized planet is having some of its layers peeled back. Astronomers using NASA's Hubble Space Telescope have discovered an immense cloud of hydrogen evaporating from a Neptune-sized planet named GJ436b. This cloud is spectacular, says the study's leader, David Ehrenreich of the Observatory of the University of Geneva in Switzerland. The research team has nicknamed it the Behemoth. The planet's atmosphere is evaporating because of extreme irradiation from its parent star, a process that might have been even more intense in the past. The parent star, which is a faint red dwarf, was once more active, says Ehrenreich. This means that the planet's atmosphere evaporated faster during its first billion years of existence. Overall, we estimate that the planet may have lost up to 10% of its atmosphere. GJ436b is considered to be a warm Neptune because of its size and because it is much closer to its parent star than Neptune is to our own Sun. Orbiting at a distance of less than 3 million miles, it whips around the central red dwarf in just 2.6 Earth days. For comparison, the Earth is 93 million miles from the Sun and orbits every 365.24 days. Systems like GJ436b could explain the existence of so-called hot super-Earths. Hot super-Earths are larger, hotter versions of our own planet. Space telescopes, such as NASA's Kepler and the French-led Corot, have discovered hundreds of them orbiting distant stars. The existence of the behemoth suggests that hot super-Earths could be the remnants of warm Neptunes that completely lost their gaseous atmospheres to evaporation. Finding a cloud around GJ436b required Hubble's ultraviolet vision. Earth's atmosphere blocks most ultraviolet light, so only a space telescope like Hubble could make the crucial observations. You would not see the behemoth in visible wavelengths because it is optically transparent, says Ehrenreich. On the other hand, it is opaque to UV rays, so when you turn the ultraviolet eye of Hubble onto the system, it's really kind of a transformation because the planet turns into a monstrous thing. The ultraviolet technique could be a game changer in exoplanet studies, he adds. Ehrenreich expects that astronomers will find thousands of warm Neptunes and super-Earths in the years ahead. Astronomers will want to examine them for evidence of evaporation. Moreover, the ultraviolet technique might be able to spot the signature of oceans evaporating on Earth-like planets, shedding new light on worlds akin to our own. Maybe you can't judge a book by its cover, but you can judge a planet by its behemoth. More news about hidden worlds in the solar system and beyond. Stay tuned to science.nasa.gov.